Hey, Rachel.
Hi, Dave.
Thank you so much for joining us. Um, Welcome, everyone, to another Apollo webinar about healing and health and the neuroscience of stress. I'm joined by a very, very special guest and colleague today who's one of the leaders in the field of trauma internationally and has been an inspiration to many of us who work in this field and on the science and clinical side. And we'll get into why today, which is very exciting. And Rachel, to give her a little bit of her background, is professor of psychiatry and neuroscience and the director of the Center for Psychedelic Psychotherapy and Trauma Research. She is also director of the Traumatic Stress Studies Division at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, which includes the PTSD Clinical Research Program and the Neurochemistry and Neuroendocrinology Laboratory at the James J. Peters VA Veterans Affairs Medical Center. And Dr. Yehuda is a recognized leader in the field of traumatic stress studies. If that wasn't enough, she has authored more than 450 publications, chapters, and books in the field of traumatic stress and the neurobiology of PTSD, which is something that we are so focused on in this day and age because of all of the stressors that we face on a regular basis. And so there couldn't be a better time to be able to have this conversation with you. We're so grateful that you took the time to join us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Dave.
Maybe we could, if you don't mind, starting off at the basics. What does trauma mean? Because it's a very stigmatized word that has a lot of associations attached to it. Maybe would you mind telling us a little bit about, maybe from from your perspective as somebody who has studied this for so long and seen the evolution of the word as well over time? What's the best way to understand that term for people?
Yeah, so it's always very hard when you use a word in the English language in the vernacular to then segue into its specific meaning in a certain context, for example, in psychiatry. But a trauma, the way we use the word is exactly how we use it. It's meant to denote a very stressful or challenging situation. And when most people use the word trauma, they think of it as the extreme end of the spectrum of stress. And so then we might want to ask, what is stress, right? And so stress is defined as anything that really is a challenge to the organism. An animal can have stress, a person can have stress. So something that really activates the fight or flight response. The kind of stressors that people have are in modern society are stressors, for example, with too much work, or if somebody's ill, or if they're ill, or perhaps their living situations are impoverished, or they have some personal problems, or even the kind of stressors that are going to result in something good. Planning a wedding, for example, many people think of as very stressful, or the first month of
Without a
having
doubt.
a baby, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, or studying for your medical exam board, you're going to be a doctor. Why is that stressful, right? But it is, and it's because your body generates a certain kind of fight or flight response. So one could say that trauma is when it's a really intense version of stress. For example, when your life is threatened, when you're exposed to interpersonal violence or combat, or you're in an accident that could have taken your life, or in a natural disaster. And I think that that was really the way trauma was defined in psychiatry, in certainly in the DSM-3, 4, and 5. But there's more to it than trauma just being an extreme version of stress, because I think there's a major difference. When it comes to a stressful event, the body recovers from the effects of the stress when you remove the challenge. So if your job is stressful and you're constantly having a fight or flight or stress-related reactions, if you change jobs or you quit your job, you should not have the effects of that any longer. You might look back and say, oh, that wasn't a good job, but you may not carry the negative effects of that challenge with you, same as planning a wedding, all of those kinds of everyday hassles.
So
But with the
you
trauma,
you work intensely, or you're stressed intensely in some way for some amount of time, then you take a break and the
then you take a
body
break.
comes back down.
But a trauma is not only a more serious problem when it's happening because the stakes are higher, you could really lose your life. But there's something about the effects of a trauma that stick and that stick well after the event is in the past. And that's what I think people meant when they first described a trauma in the DSM-3. They defined it as an event that anyone would think is distressing. But unfortunately, that wasn't a good enough definition that later sparked revisions to try to get a little bit more objective about it. But really, a trauma is in the eyes of the beholder. What will be traumatic for you might not be traumatic for me, or what might stick with you in terms of an event that really, whose effects linger well beyond they should, may be very, very different. But I like to think of a trauma as like a watershed, an event that really kind of divides and frames your life in a certain way. And that is just not true of stress.
Right. And there's a certain, and that was very, very nicely put. And I think that there's a there's a lot to that, right? There's so much that falls under that watershed and what sort of contributes to those experiences, one of which is that's commonly talked about is a lack of safety, right? Where there's a certain fundamental feeling in that moment that we're not safe in the situation. And sometimes it's not necessarily recognized as much in the moment as it is afterwards. But that's, would you say that's a component of traumatic events for a lot of people?
For a lot of people, for sure, it's this idea that you could lose your life, that not only are you unsafe, but you don't know how to become safe in that moment. You're not exactly sure what to do. Your body takes over a little bit. A lot of aspects of fight or flight happen at an automatic level. You make some decisions, but really your body's making a lot of these decisions without your mind in the immediate coping with trauma. But I think that what trauma is defined a lot in retrospect because it's only with the passage of time that you can that you can ascertain that the effects of the event lingered. So
Right.
for some people, even a life-threatening event, they might have died in a car accident, right? And then the fight or flight, the immediate fight or flight response subsides, their heart starts beating normal, they get back in their car, drive away, and say, whoa, that was close. Glad nothing really happened. And they may not feel traumatized by it. So it's really, trauma is defined really in retrospect by the nature of the event as lingering for you. A lot of people think that it has to involve life threat. I think this is a debate. I think watching something happen to someone else it can be very traumatic also, even though you're watching.
Sure.
So it's not your life threat, maybe it's their life threat. So I
and
think
also emotional threat, right? Things that might make you fear for your emotional safety or your spiritual safety in some ways for people can also be perceived as traumatic in retrospect.
in retrospect, right. I think while something like that is happening, you're not quite sure what's happening because you're alive and well. But after the fact, and usually it can be quite a bit after the fact, you realize that, wow, somebody was emotionally abusing me and this actually threatened my safety and my integrity, but I didn't realize it at the time. It's the kind of thing that can come up later. So again, people tend to use a trauma sometimes to an event that isn't that serious, but they're just being dramatic or they're trying to emphasize a point. It's used in the common vernacular. But really, I think a good way to think about it is an effect that continues, an event whose effects continue to linger well after the actual threat has passed.
Right. And you brought up something so fascinating that I think we should dive into a little bit, which is the importance of language, right? And the way that we describe the word, as you said, maybe the the description of it in the DSM, which a lot of people take as definition, and the DSM-3 was not the best or not the most accurate. And then there's this way that you also describe traumatic events as something that has to be evaluated in retrospect, right? We don't necessarily know that it's going to turn into what we call have a traumatic effect on our lives over time. In the moment, we don't know how we're going to necessarily react to it before we react to it. But that it's subjective, right? It's a very personal, subjective experience through the eyes of the beholder. And so it really makes you think that if we often label these events as traumatic, as you said, you kind of alluded to, long before we know what the outcome down the road in our future will be. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You label it when it happens as something that you can't recover from, or that you associate with who you are and your identity. And then it becomes an illness identity that sticks with you for a long period of time.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting what you say, because I think when I started in the field, it was the opposite problem. Since nobody knew what PTSD was, the assumption about everything was you'll get over it, right? Everything. Tomorrow's a new day. Don't think about it anymore. You'll get over it. Time will heal you. But now I think we're suffering from the opposite problem, which is an expectancy. Because we've heard so much about the negative effects of trauma, we get very worried early on that a potentially traumatic event may give us a mental health condition. And you know what that does? It just perpetuates the worry and probably doesn't do much to make that untrue. Because the most important thing really that a person can do after they're exposed to trauma is try to calm down, because it's the activation of the sympathetic nervous system that really needs to be kind of contained and shut down. And when you can do that, then even though you've had a potentially life-threatening event, you may be able to tell yourself something that puts you on the road to recovery, such as, whoa, that was close. I'm glad nothing bad happened. Or, hey, I handled that pretty well. So you can tell yourself things after a traumatic experience that may mitigate against developing PTSD, or your mind can kind of work with you to kind of ramp you up. I could have died. Oh my God, it was my fault, you know. And so these narratives are not just narratives. These narratives come with an entire biologic expression. And so if you can really stay calm in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, not too calm, because you want to process the event, and the event was distressing. And if you're too calm, then you're avoiding, right? And you don't want to take drugs like Valium or anything like that, because you actually do want to deal with the fact that something happened, but you want to just be in the right window of tolerance. You want to be in the right zone of accepting that something terrible happened, but hey, you survived it.
Right. And it's really, I love how you put that. And it's really like, it's all, like you said, calming the body down, you know, and making sure that after you or someone you know has experienced trauma, providing that support, which is oftentimes why having even just an empathic conversation with someone after a traumatic event can be so therapeutic and helpful, and really just allow a lot of processing and grief in a lot of ways, right? After a very challenging event, if we step back from trauma, we're looking at pre-trauma. This is a challenging experience that is potentially a tremendous opportunity for growth. As hard as it was, we are able to reflect on it and maybe, as you said, change the narrative that we live by, right? We're really shifting early on by being present and focused on, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, I think teaches a lot of these techniques that are of thought processing that are really great. But those are really great things that you can do after the fact.
I mean, you know, you're so right. And it makes me think about, you know, there's always been this debate in the field of psychology about whether your thoughts are a function of interpreting your body, or whether your body is reacting to your thoughts. But it's actually that both things are true. I mean, why do you think that the natural response when your child is hurt or when someone you love gets hurt is to give them a hug? right? Why are you giving them a hug? It's an instinctive response of trying to calm down their sympathetic nervous system, to try to get their body to be in a calmer place. Because when your body is calm, then if you say, I'm okay, you might actually believe it. It's hard to tell yourself you're okay if you're shaking and shivering and your heart is beating out of your chest, because your body's contradicting those words. So eventually it becomes like a feedback loop between words and body and words. But all of those inputs are important. And so the idea of hugging someone or otherwise soothing them or otherwise calming them down, or really calming down yourself instead of working yourself up, is really the best thing that you can do in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event.
Well put. And I think this is a great segue to some of my favorite work of your work, which is the recent studies, or I should say they go back a little ways now, but your studies of Holocaust survivors and the starting to understand how, when we talk about these responses that the body has to stressful thoughts, or thoughts of a past stressful event, or just the experience of stress, or challenging experiences, there is a response in the body that is remembered as well. And Bessel van der Kolk writes about this, and many others do. Body Keeps the Score is one of the great books that I think, as a psychiatrist, brought that into the way that we think about trauma and how experiences are stored in the body. But the body has memory to a large extent. And you were one of the people who helped to understand, I think, about sort of how that memory is stored. Eric Kandel talked a lot about how that memory is stored in the brain and the neural networks, but you actually took it to another level with looking at the DNA and the markings on the DNA that encode the way genes are expressed. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and how trauma can be actually affect DNA expression?
Yes, I sure can. Thank you. I think, though, that I'd want to remind us that the best thing that you can possibly do after you've been exposed to a trauma is remember it. And I think that that's a little counterintuitive, because one of the most distressing symptoms of PTSD is having these uncontrollable, intrusive, traumatic memories, which are really, really distressing. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but your body's meant to learn from experience. So if, for example, you're living in a certain situation and there is a neighborhood that's dangerous, or a road that isn't clearly marked, or any of the, or you're out at 3 a.m, or something like that. If you have a traumatic experience, not your fault, but you are well served by remembering the things that happened to you, or being able to, for the purpose of being able to either avoid traumatic events or do better next time. So there is a major advantage of having a trauma memory. So then the question is, how do you really keep this memory alive? And a lot of things have been written. Eric Kandel's work is masterful work about really the molecular basis of, what is a physical memory, right? How do our bodies store memories? What are they stored as? Are they stored as chemicals? Or are they, what is a memory anyway? I mean, what we showed was that basically there are long-term stress hormonal effects in trauma survivors that far surpass the immediate fight or flight response, and actually in many ways don't resemble the hormonal response in the fight or flight stage. So for example, one of the things that happens in fight or flight is you have increased levels of adrenaline and increases in the hormone cortisol. And you need to have those increases in cortisol to help partly contain the body's adrenaline response. So you're really having a rush of hormones at the time of fight or flight. Well, what we showed was that people that have PTSD have lower cortisol levels, even though their adrenaline levels are significantly higher. And that even if you study people in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, their cortisol levels look a little bit lower than they should look, considering it's a trauma, in people who end up developing PTSD. And we thought that that was a very big medical mystery, actually. Like, why would there be lower stress hormone levels in the context of a stress disorder? That just didn't make sense, especially since patients that have major depression are known to have higher cortisol levels because it's stressful to have a psychiatric illness. So,
and I think it's important to note, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but that this finding of yours went against what was thought at the time, and a lot of people didn't believe you, right?
Alas, no. I mean, that's true. When we first had this finding, there were a bunch of things going on. One is that PTSD was trying to establish itself as a diagnosis, and 40 years ago, this wasn't going so smoothly. Psychiatry didn't understand why you needed a diagnosis like PTSD, because the entire model of stress was that the effects go away after the challenge is gone. And this idea that some effects lingered, it didn't have a scientific basis. Now, for PTSD to survive, it needed a biology, right, in 1980. And the biology that would have been convenient was to show that there are elevations in the stress hormone cortisol, just as there were in depression. So finding low cortisol was an inconvenient truth for sure at a time when the disorder was searching for a biology, but really there wasn't a way to explain it. So
speaking of overcoming great adversity.
Well, even when we found the results, I mean, I knew I didn't make them up, but I also didn't quite know what to make of the findings, but we kept at it. We did a series of studies over a 10-year period that were really designed to try to understand why cortisol levels are low. And it wasn't until we could do work in epigenetics that we were able to really nail it. That the idea here is that the reason that cortisol levels are low is because there have been epigenetic changes in stress-related genes as a result of trauma exposure that kind of recalibrate the body after exposure to a trauma in people that develop PTSD, and probably also in people that develop PTSD symptoms, but without the full-blown event. Now, a lot of people know what epigenetics is already. Epigenetics refer to a series of kind of biologic marks. For example, methylation, which is a carbon with 3 hydrogens, or other kind of chemicals that are present in abundance in the cellular environment, in the cell nucleus, because they're byproducts of other chemical reactions. And in the presence of the right enzymes, these biologic marks can sit on top of the DNA, or in the DNA environment, in the chromatin or in the histones, and they can change the way that the genes function. And even though the term epigenetics was used in the 1940s, methylation marks weren't really discovered until maybe the 70s or 60s or 70s. They started to be looked at in cancer research. And it was really not until the 80s that epigenetics came to neuroscience and psychiatry. And I think we were the first people to really think about epigenetics, certainly in the context of PTSD. But the way that we thought about it is, people were talking a lot about gene bioenvironment interactions and the importance of genes in regulating or determining your biology, and maybe low cortisol came from different genes. The way we thought about it is that genetics might be the computer, right? But epigenetics might be the software. And that in response to an environmental event, epigenetic changes could occur on genes that change the way those genes function. And maybe the kind of gene, the version of the gene you have or the allele is relevant to the kind of epigenetic changes that occur. But there was no question that we were looking at a molecular process that was pretty much mostly determined by the environment. So that when people are saying, I'm not the same person I used to be following a traumatic experience, epigenetics really provided the right language to begin to kind of understand that in a way that's true. In a way, the genes are not functioning the way they used to function. And I think this work was exciting, and epigenetics is now really something that is talked about a lot, not only in the context of psychiatric disorders, but in all sorts of fields where people are wondering what the long-term impact is of doing something short-term, right? So I think that that's been very important to the field of trauma, really kind of giving a model for why the events of something that is no longer an active threat remains so pernicious, because stress hormone theory wasn't going to do that.
Right.
So
it wasn't going to explain how this could last for so long.
It just wasn't. And again, and so much was riding on it too, because in the beginning, there really was, I wouldn't say opposition to the diagnosis, but it was regarded with some skepticism that maybe this is a political diagnosis. Maybe this is about compensation. Maybe, that what would be the science behind it? But now there's science behind it. And this is a science that is going to turn out to be really useful in understanding treatment responses, especially for treatments that you may not have to do continuously, that you might just have to do once. And then it's a gift that keeps on giving. And in fact, we have found that there are epigenetic changes that can occur in response to just talk therapy. And so that becomes a really important conversation about not only the body keeping the score, but the body being able to change and adapt in the face of newer events, because there is life after trauma. And if you compound, if you keep experiencing positive events, or you try to get your body to respond to newer stimuli, then you might also create epigenetic changes that help your body become restored or to take it to a new place.
That is fascinating. So let me see if I can break this down for everyone into the simplest way that I understand it, which is that because what you're saying is really actually, I mean, it's profound for the field of PTSD, but it's also just generally profound in terms of the way that we are taught to understand the interaction between our biology and the environment, right? And what you're saying is that there is something in all of us called DNA, and the DNA is in every cell in our whole bodies, and it's identical in every cell basically of our whole bodies except our sperm and egg, right? And every cell otherwise has all the same DNA, but the epigenetics is the code on like the methyl groups that get put onto the DNA, and they tell those genes that are the same in every cell which to turn on and on and off and up and down to regulate all the responses of the cell, including probably which cells they turn into, right?
Well, that's how the concept was initially conceptualized in the 1940s by Conrad Waddington. He said, well, there's got to be some mechanism that allows the organism to differentiate. And we start out from one cell. So as the cell divides and divides and divides and divides, how do some cells know to become skin cells, and other cells know to become heart cells, and other cells know to become brain cells? And he said, well, there must be something that is controlling that, some kind of program that is turning some genes on and some genes off. Now, the fact that the environment can do this too is what's novel.
Right.
So the idea that genes get turned on and off is just biology. But the idea that can be influenced by the things that happen to us, and by extension, the decisions we make about what to do.
And that's what's so profound, right? Is
Very
that
big
that
news.
you can, the things that happen to us and the decisions that, down to every decision that we make as a result of interacting with the environment and things that happen to us, in some form is likely impacting how those genes are turned on and off.
It means that what we do, it means two things. What we do matters, what happens to us matters. And we're not kind of victims of circumstances. We have the ability to transform and to change and to grow and to adapt. Also to kind of fall down and to fall into harm's way and to function less well. I mean, what happens to us matters, and we can do all those things. What gets a little dicey is that we don't want to oversimplify it, because probably not every gene is subject to the same kind of environmental regulation. For sure, we know that. And a random methyl mark on a random cytosine base on a DNA, it doesn't happen that way.
Right.
That there's still quite a lot of very detailed information that governs which regions of which genes change under which circumstances. But the general idea of epigenetics, I think, has just been a real way to be able to think about why events matter. And then when you add onto that, which I know is your next question, probably the intergenerational component, that's just jaw-dropping. The fact that the things that our parents may have done might also in some way live inside of us, or that we might carry remnants of ways that our parents tried to cope with adversity also. It is a mind-boggling idea, really.
How did you get to the intergenerational part of the story?
Totally by accident, like everything else. We started a clinic for Holocaust survivors at Mount Sinai in the early 90s. And I tell this story often. It was a woman that I met at one of the participants in the study, who was so symptomatic for so long. I just had to say, why didn't you ever go seek therapy? I mean, the way she was describing how she felt, it just boggled the mind that you could be this distressed and never seek help. And she said, well, we don't have VAs like your veterans do. Who on earth could we possibly go to that would understand this? And it was a serious comment. And at the time I was just beginning, I was looking for a job. I actually had this interview with this Holocaust survivor as part of my postdoctoral work. And I was interviewing at Mount Sinai for a job. I said to my chairman, I would really like to start a clinic for Holocaust survivors. And he said, it's a great idea. So we did. But what happened was that adult children of Holocaust survivors called us. Really, pretty much, we would get 3 calls from a second generation Holocaust survivor for every call we got from a Holocaust survivor. And at first, I'm Jewish. Wow. I grew up with a lot of Holocaust offspring. I didn't know what people were saying to me, because I didn't.
It's hard to believe.
It's hard to believe. You grow up with people, you don't think that there's a thing there. Their parents are from Europe, and you talk about the Holocaust in hushed tones, but you don't get into a lot of detail. So at first I didn't understand it, but then, look, somebody's calling for help. What you do is you interview them and you say, why are you here for treatment? And pretty soon, many people were describing something that seemed like a very clear thing about how the effects of being raised by their parents had impacted them, their ability to form relationships, how they were walking around waiting for the other shoe to drop, how they felt for sure that the Holocaust could come again at any time. And just, they felt, the world was a dark place, even though sometimes they were very successful. And so they didn't understand it themselves. And so we began to study the same kind of hormonal changes and found similar hormonal changes in adult children of Holocaust survivors. We unpacked that quite a bit, different effects for mother, father, PTSD, no PTSD. But by the time we started looking at epigenetic marks in PTSD, we immediately started applying it to offspring and found that in the adult children of Holocaust survivors, even if they had never had PTSD, they had changes. Now, in some cases, it was if their mother had PTSD. In some cases, it was just based on trauma exposure. And so, again, at first, scientific community's reaction is, you know, how can this be? You know, that's the natural response when there isn't a paradigm. And it was our response too. I mean, we didn't think that this could be inherited. We thought that all this meant was that when adult children of Holocaust survivors say that they are traumatized by their upbringing, that trauma is in their body. We thought it was maybe the upbringing. But it turns out that there is now quite a lot of research to support the idea of potentially an intergenerational transmission of a trauma sign that is in the parent through the egg or sperm, and also for this to be further influenced in the in uterine environment, which explains some of the differences we've seen based on if there's a mother or a father that have PTSD. So we don't understand all of it. I know this finding is already about 5 years old, but we're still just at the beginning. It's a very tough nut to crack, because when you're looking at someone 50 years later with a cross-sectional viewpoint, you can't like roll back the tape and know everything that has happened. But the idea has really taken on, and I think a lot of people are now doing research in this area. So I think in a few years, we will have the kind of animal and human studies that will be able to go further than what we've done.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That it's such an incredible discovery, and it is confusing. We haven't seen, you know, it's such a, you know, just like seeing cortisol low initially when you were looking at the folks with PTSD the first time, it's hard to contextualize when doesn't fit within the paradigm, and then you have the opportunity to evaluate it and look at it from, you know, a different paradigm, and all of a sudden it starts to open up a whole nother window into so many different areas of study. And the idea that you can, so if these epigenetic changes to the HPA or stress response, some of the stress response proteins like cortisol can get, or cortisol receptor, they can get passed down over time across generations. And yet psychotherapy, for instance, can fix or reverse in some ways some of those changes, which we do see clinically. Of course, it's just never before been shown in the epigenetic level. Is it possible for people to remodel their epigenetic framework for healing and recovery, even multiple generations down?
Yeah, I think so. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite animal studies, it's done by Brian Diaz, and when he worked with Carrie Ressler, is a study where they taught mice how to fear the smell of cherry blossoms. And they did this by exposing the mouse to an electric shock, right? So when you expose a mouse to electric shock with a cherry blossom, eventually you don't need the shock. The mouse smells the cherry blossom and is conditioned. So what they found were that there were epigenetic changes in the mouse brain and in the mouse sperm. And when they mated the mouse, the next generation mice also had the same epigenetic changes in brain and sperm. And guess what? The children, the mouse offspring, male mice offspring, were afraid of cherry blossoms, even without being convinced. And it happened one further generation down. Now, if before you mated the mouse, you did something called fear extinction, which is that after the mouse is afraid of the cherry blossom, you keep exposing the cherry blossom to the mouse repeatedly until the mouse forgets that there used to be a shock, and now we're back to the cherry blossom being an enjoyable thing or not a stressful thing. You get rid of the epigenetic changes in the mouse and in the offspring, and those offspring are not born afraid of cherry blossoms. So to
Holy
me,
cow.
it is holy cow. It's really nice. To me, it's a really interesting study, and it also shows, you know, there are a lot of things that animal models can't do, especially when we talk about trauma and consciousness, and there's so many things that those models like are limited in. But this is an example of something fantastic that animal work can do. We can really explore this. I mean, it's possible to do in vitro fertilization also, to examine the impact of oocytes in an uterine environment and cross-fostering. These are the kinds of things that lend themselves beautifully to animal work. Again, it's not as richly textured in terms of the effects, but at least it gives us a proof of concept that, you know, we're not just dreaming these things. And when you think about nature and you think about evolution and you think about really the fact that we have children and we want to teach our children, we're not going to teach them everything based on how we raise them. Some of the information that we want to transmit must have to somehow come in the form of some bodily, if you will, memory. But the other thing that you said that I thought was really important, Dave, was that when we're talking about DNA and the effects of the environment, I mean, it makes us part of the world. The idea is that we exist in a world because we're part of the world. And, you know, without sounding too Eastern, not that there's anything wrong with that, I think that that's a very important aspect of what this gene by environment work or the epigenetic changes are about. It's not like us and the world out there. It's a completely symbiotic, intertwined situation where we are the world, literally, because we're carrying the world in us, and the world is carrying us on it, which is really a lot of our conversations about global warming are about. So it's really this complete symbiosis, I think.
Yeah, very, very well said. And I think that there's also, you know, Francis Crick, I feel like also talked about that with DNA and the fact that DNA is so universal in all living things. And it's uniting and humbling to know that we share our fundamental thing that codes for all of our everything with every other living thing on the earth. And the epigenetic component may be that it may be that language in some ways that stores the interactions, good and bad, constructive and destructive, whatever we want to, however we end up interpreting meaning from them is down the road, but the interactions themselves and are stored in that epigenetic language in some ways, which is so interesting. And it makes me, when listening to what you were saying about that study about the cherry blossoms, makes me want to question all of my fears and dislikes and aversions, right? Because when you think about how many times have we found ourselves having conversations with people where we're thinking about like, oh, why do I dislike this thing? Or somebody even asks you, right? Like, why do you not like this? You're just like, I don't know, I've just never liked it, right? And maybe there's something that happened.
Maybe there are reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's something that happened to you as a kid, but maybe it's because your parents didn't like it that you don't like it. Right? It may not be.
Sometimes you learn that, right? Sometimes you kind of learn that incidentally, that sure. You have something in common, or somebody tells you that you have a trait that your father or your grandparent had, or something like that, and you're not aware of having noticed it or right. Consciously inhaled it, but there it is, right? Or a mannerism, or now one could say it's genetics, right? And that's what we've been saying for a long time, but maybe it's not just genetics. Maybe it's It's how the environment influenced the genetics. And it's the sum total of that that now is going to influence you. And then your environment will modify things yet again. But it's important not to get stuck in a narrative of, oh no, it's not just my own events I have to worry about, but it's the generations before me. No, I don't think that the meaning is that we're stuck. I think the meaning is that what we do matters. And it's really a mandate to be proactive so that we can feel unhelpless, which I think is the hallmark of trauma and PTSD, this idea of one being helpless because they can't control the world. But controlling your responses to the world is pretty major.
Yeah. And it's so, and I would say, you know, to add on to what you were saying, it's really empowering to understand the way the body works in this way, because we, you know, when you think about what's genetic in our DNA, you know, we admit that there are certain things like our DNA we cannot change. We're not changing the way that A's, C's, T's, and G's are strung together. That's the same in every cell in our bodies, but we can change the way that those get turned on and off and expressed by doing things, as you said. And if we know that we can do that, just like negative experience can do it to us, we can change our response intentionally. We can put intention into our actions and time, in a little bit of time, into thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and doing it intentionally in and of itself can actually start to push the limits on what we're actually capable of, right? It brings up this question of, if I really want to know what is genetic that is fixed and what is epigenetic or not fixed about me as a human being, it's up to me to test those limits, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll just even give you another, animal study, right? Because it's relevant to what you've said. I mean, in addition to the idea of trauma effects being carried forward in sperm and then being obliterated if once the animal's behavior is changed, the work that got me interested in epigenetics was work by Michael Meaney that started in the late 1980s, that had to do with the effects of maternal licking and grooming on rat pups. And what happened was that this was initially a paradigm to look at how mothers and their rat pups behave when the mother is removed from the cage, when pups are 11 days old, and handled for 15 minutes and then brought back in the cage. And it was supposed to be a model for early maternal stress or maternal separation. But what happened was that the investigators observed that when mothers came back to the cage after being handled, they would furiously lick and groom their pups. And what they noticed was that they could kind of, over generations, develop a phenotype of a high licking and grooming rat and a low licking and grooming rat, and that those rat mothers had differences in stress-related epigenetic genes, not the mothers themselves, but their offspring, that could then be passed on. And so that is a story about how your early behavior as a mother postnatally can also rebuild your child's stress response genes and result in epigenetic changes in perpetuity for the child. And when they did cross-fostering studies where they put different pups with different mothers so as to rule out any genetic contributions, they found that the effect was entirely mediated by the maternal behavior, even if it wasn't your own mother. So
wow,
it is wow. It is really wow that there have been so many juicy stories in the neuroscience world that are so relevant and such object lessons for us. The way that we attach with our babies postnatally sets them up for how stress responsive genes behave in the course of their lifetime. So again, the lesson is always what happens matters, what we do matters. It all matters very much. And if we really internalize this lesson of what we do matters, I mean, think about how we could channel that for good.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We just don't really believe it, I think. I think we're still stuck in this old paradigm of, okay, stress response is over. It's a new day. The past is the past and has no relevance to the current moment. But if we really internalize our connection with history, with the past, with everything that comes before, with the earth and the environment, then I think that, you know, we can take we can be present in the world in such a different way.
With all the wisdom of the past, right? On our side rather than against us. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our potential, I feel like in that way, we're just in that way, looking at how far we've come in humanity as humans, it's like we've really just scratched the surface of what we're capable of.
Exactly right.
And it's really incredible to think about. And you definitely answered my next question for you, which was what do you think is the most exciting stuff in the field? I mean, this sounds like the most exciting stuff in the field to me. But feel free to add on to that.
You know, what I've been sort of sad about is that this really interesting science that we've done hasn't really resulted in treatment for people with PTSD. And you know, I think what it's done is it's introduced important components of treatment. And I think it's also provided models for being able to predict treatment response or try to determine whether a good response has occurred. But what I've been really excited about lately is the fact that we may be able to treat the effects of not only trauma that occurs to people, but also perhaps even intergenerational trauma with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and specifically with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So lately I've been really excited about that, and it's the direction that my own research is going to take, because I think, you know, after more than 30 years of really trying to understand deeply what PTSD is and what trauma is from a molecular and clinical, and also I think spiritual and existential perspective, you know, my team and I are ready to make a real difference in people's lives. And the outcome data from the last trial for MDMA assisted psychotherapy has filled a lot of us with really great hope, because until recently, you know, you can make people a little bit better. And when you do, you kind of cross your fingers and hope that they don't, you know, that another event doesn't kind of bring back the symptoms. But I think that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy kind of fits very well with some of the biologic models that we've developed in terms of just the transformational power of a profound experience, which being treated with a psychedelic can be. So yeah, I'm really very excited about that, and applying the study of epigenetics to how psychedelics may be working to provide transformative effects.
Right, and that we might be, and it's a very exciting time for mental health in general, because these medicines that are currently in FDA, many of them are in big trials, and psilocybin and MDMA are currently in FDA trials for treatment resistant, or for depression and PTSD respectively. But the results have been profound. I mean, they've been better in terms of the actual remission rates, it seems so far, than perhaps any other medicine that's ever been developed for PTSD. I mean, that is with less treatments and less side effects. That's really quite amazing.
I think that there's a lot of hope now. And so there's still a lot more work to do. And I think, you know, I'm watching that the field is getting super excited. And, you know, every time people get overly excited, I kind of want to I kind of want to say, okay, let's calm down a little. But I don't, I'm excited too, but I think that the jury's still out around how to do this kind of work in community settings and in very complicated cases, and in cases that are really representative of people's clinical practices. And we have a lot of issues that we're going to have to grapple with around what to do with people that have been chronically treated with antidepressants, and how will we take them off of antidepressants to try something new. I think that there's still a lot of things that we need to think very carefully about, but I'm very excited about it. I think that it would be really nice, because the neuroscience and the molecular neurobiology suggests that it is possible to kind of transform the effects of trauma from negative effects to more positive effects. And it would be really nice if we had a way to do it and we could demonstrate the effect, demonstrate how it works. That would be just really very nice.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be incredible for psychiatry and for mental health to have tools like this, which we have not had access to since the 50s and 60s, unfortunately.
Well, we have tools like this in terms of the medication, but we've never had the kind of molecular tools that we have. We've never been able to look inside of a living cell.
Right.
We can even transform skin cells into stem cells and reprogram them into neurons and see what psychedelics do in live cells now, which is work that we're going to be doing very soon. I mean, there are things we can do now that, we couldn't even dream about when at least I started in the field. And to be able to harness all the knowledge that we've gained towards really understanding how people can make deep changes that stick to their mental health is a very heartening experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of, this is I think, thinking about MDMA is really interesting because I was trained under the MAPS MDMA, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies MDMA protocol, as you were. And we, one of the things that was really interesting about getting that training for working with patients with PTSD and MDMA is that the safety component that always stuck out to me. And this also stuck out to me from CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy with exposure, where the therapist is really the therapy is about holding space for the individual to go through any number of experiences, connecting with different parts of their subconscious that they may have forgotten or that are wounded or ashamed, as well as even reliving or re-experiencing the traumatic event, but in a context of safety. And yet at the same time, it was always frustrating to me that I would love to use this tool, but even after getting the training, the tool is still, MDMA is still legal, right? It's still very challenging, if not impossible, to use it legally outside of a clinical trial setting. And so that was very much inspirational to me, along with cognitive behavioral therapy exposure, for developing Apollo and trying to create something that people could take out of the clinic or take home with them every day that could provide almost like an extinction stimulus, right? It's like a little nudge of safety through the touch receptor system that, can provide a little bit of autonomic balance or a little bit of reminder that if you have time to pay attention to this feeling on your body, this gentle vibration, just like a hug or someone holding your hand on a bad day, that you can't possibly be running from a lion right now. And over time, using techniques like Apollo is not unique in the way that works. Deep breathing works the same way in a lot of respects. Soothing touch from a loved one works the same way. Holding a purring cat, hanging out by the ocean, they all do very similar things to the autonomic nervous system, but creating experiences like that for ourselves can be really important as a way to help recovery in general, it seems.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And so trying to kind of understand what the key components are and bringing them into technologies that we can use today and things that we can try today is just like a really important thing.
And the safety aspect, right? The idea of safety is a meaning that we interpret from our environment. And that could be our sense of safety in some ways could be understood by our body differently than we understand it cognitively. We may think in our minds only about physical safety, but our body may sense safety in other ways from things that we don't necessarily know why they are triggering or were perceived as threatening, or we're just overwhelmed, right? And our system is sort of ramped up to respond to anything that could be threatening. So just providing that safety is so helpful.
Symptom about them. So a lot of people with PTSD who are hypervigilant, they don't complain about that symptom.
That's interesting.
They don't want a medicine to dull them because they're convinced that their ability to now be a better threat detector is actually one of the good things that have come out of this for them. And, there's something in it. There's something in it because, again, of this idea of trying to learn from trauma. So, I mean, what people don't like, the thing people mind the most is that, of course, they can't sleep and they have a lot of nightmares and they don't want to have untriggered reminders of the trauma that cause a fight or flight response. But some symptoms are more okay for people than others. And this idea that you are a better detector of threat, I think people think isn't necessarily a negative. When you teach people that they have control over their physiology, but can reactivate and go on heightened alert when they have to be, I think that that's very reassuring to people, that they are in control, that they don't have to stay on alarm all the time, that not everything is a threat, and that their threat detect, it's like having a smoke detector. You don't want it going off all the time. It would drive you crazy just to make sure that it would go off with a fire. And then if there's a fire, you wouldn't listen to it anyway if it's going off all the time. But if you kind of teach people that their threat detector is there, and it's a lot of times this is why people don't want to take a chronic medicine, because what if I won't hear the fire alarm? And so I think,
right,
I understand it very well. I think it's a very legitimate type of concern.
It's a protective mechanism.
Mechanism. I mean, if you'd rather have that than the fire alarm blaring in your ear all day long, you can. That's worse. So people eventually give in and take the medicine. But again, this idea that you have a keener threat detector, it's a symptom of PTSD called hypervigilance, but it's not necessarily something that trauma survivors always hate. Compared to other symptoms that are just really very difficult to tolerate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually, I think, one of the other reasons why people who have had traumatic events in the past have had such great responses to Apollo overall, is because it allows them to reduce some of their burden of the sedative medicines that they might be taking for the constant negative ruminating thoughts, or the thoughts of constantly never feeling safe and always having that alarm bell going off and questioning whether I'm safe, and allows them to sort of settle and recognize that they're safe in that moment, and that they don't need to take the Xanax, or they don't need to take the Valium or any number of other medicines that could be prescribed for this kind of thing. Even SSRIs to some extent can dull responses to things in our environment, not just on the negative side of the spectrum, but also on the positive side. And we see this all the time with decreased libido and decreased joy and feelings of numbness to the environment. So it's an excellent point that you brought up, and I really appreciate I really appreciate you mentioning that.
Yeah, it's what you have to understand about some trauma survivors is that when they have the activation of the fight or flight, it's on the one hand, it's awful, but it reminds them of a time in their lives that sometimes they may have felt very alive also, or very important, depending on what the trauma is. This is not true of interpersonal violence, but it may be true in the context of combat. And so, our bodily memories really do need to be and can be interpreted in multiple ways. So I think that when we're in control of those narratives to a large extent. So
that's the whole point of psychotherapy in a lot of ways, is to facilitate sort of this safe enough environment to facilitate radical self-inquiry, right? It's like being able to feel comfortable and safe enough that I can look inside myself and let whatever comes out come out, and I'm not going to be judged for it, and I'm not going to judge myself for it, and I'm just going to let it be and try to see what it has to tell me, and then we'll go from there. So I want to, do you have time for a few questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think that there are many questions, but I can't read and talk at the same time, unfortunately.
Well, luckily I can help with that.
Okay.
We had an interesting one about, it says, you talk about the way that not just trauma can get inherited or passed on, but you mentioned resilience. And this person wanted to know if you could talk about how we can keep the good resilience and focus on, and we did get into this a little bit, so you don't have to go into great detail, but about how you can try to get more of the resilience to be trained and passed on, even if you have experienced trauma.
The resilience is passed on. We don't know if only negative things get passed. What we know is that whatever mechanism, that's something in the response may stick. So the way that I like to explain it very simply is that, let's say your father decides to give you a knife for your 7th birthday, right? Now, a knife may or may not be an appropriate gift for a 7-year-old, but if you're living in a war zone and there are a lot of gangs around and the knife may end up saving your life, it's a great gift. It may also be a terrible gift because you can end up hurting yourself with a knife. A knife has neutral uses. When you're a little older, you may cut your food with it. A knife can be a surgeon's knife and save lives. When we talk about an epigenetic change that we think is a consequence of an experience the parent had, we're talking about the fact that we are measuring the presence of a knife. And what you do with that knife, how you use it, and in what context is really kind of up to you, really. So I think that biology isn't overdetermined in that way of making a decision. Well, I think I'll just give you something negative, but the resilience you're on your own for. It's all packed into some sort of meta lesson of something I want you to know about what you might need for a situation that I was confronted with. And if you have the same situation, maybe this kind of, call it knowledge, call it it's not a true memory in the sense of the way that our regular memories are encoded, but it's certainly a piece of information. And, again, I'll be the last person to tell you I understand it fully because I have a lot more questions than I have answers, but I do think of it more as something neutral. And again, if you're living in a war zone, having hypervigilance is good. If you're living in peacetime, people will think you're just very hyper or paranoid. So it's what you get, but it's also the context in which you're living that really matters. And so if your parents are preparing you for a very traumatic context of war, but you live in peacetime, you're just going to have a mismatch. It's going to be a gift that you can't really use, or but the intention was not that. Like, you know, when you get an ugly sweater for Christmas, right? Nobody set out to buy you an ugly sweater. But maybe it's not something you can use, or it wasn't your taste, or it doesn't fit into your circumstance. But I think that's where the epigenetics story gets overinterpreted when we start putting in words like, these are resilient marks and these are vulnerability marks, and maybe they're just marks. And
right. We don't know what their meaning is.
That makes it so. But the fact that we have them, the fact that we can have something from a prior generation is kind of an amazing thing, even if it's a negative thing.
Right. Even if it's perceived, yeah, even if it's perceived as negative, it may actually be.
It's still kind of cool.
It's extraordinarily cool. And I think, you know, to your point, you know, the metaphor of the knife is such a good one, because it could, if we reserve judgment of that thing, then and we try to stay present with it and really inquire as to what it's trying to tell us without misinterpreting or over interpreting or trying to predict the future, it might even be a good thing.
Right. Molecules are just molecules. And, you know, they don't have this whole place where things get interpreted or spun, or, you know, they're not woke, they're not politically incorrect, they're not politically correct, they're just doing as they're programmed to do. And so it's up to us to make the interpretations about whether having a sign of an ancestral experience means something positive or is interfering with us. But the fact that we have it means that what happens to us might also impact our children, and we can have an enormous amount of, you know, mindfulness around the kinds of things that we may want to transmit through our experiences or our behavior.
Yeah, it's really quite amazing, and what a time to be in this field.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a really, that was a great answer, because I think you read into it a lot more than I even did when I was thinking about it. That was really helpful. And I'm wondering what, we have a couple questions here. Feel free to defer if you're not the best person to answer this, but because it's more of a clinical question. But someone was asking if we could recommend resources for adults who have had childhood trauma, and those could, I mean, it could be any kind of resources, books, you know, to help understand some of the stuff that we're talking about, or practitioners or studies that they could participate in. I know MAPS currently has openings. Actually, that's a good idea to talk about. MAPS has openings. The leading study that we were talking about with MDMA for PTSD, currently for people with PTSD, the study ended up getting delayed because of COVID, and now they've reopened and they are looking for subjects in this incredible it's an incredible opportunity to be one of the first people to go through this treatment. Rachel has trained many people as well to do this, but what do you think, Rachel?
I think it's very hard without meeting someone to give a specific advice. So I'll give generic advice. So the generic advice is that if you've been exposed to childhood trauma, you are not alone. 25% of Americans have been exposed to some form of childhood adversity. So I don't know if that makes you feel better, but it should destigmatize the experience. And really, a lot of people are suffering from this. So that's the first thing. We mentioned Bessel van der Kolk's book, which is a good resource. The books of Gabor Mate I find to be very helpful also. There are a lot of good books to read. These days, almost any therapist, if you talk about the fact that you want to explore the impact of your childhood with them, that's what they went to school to learn how to do. You don't have to go to a specialist anymore. When in 1980 you did, in 1990 maybe you did, but in 2021, this is the bread and butter of mental health right now. And people, almost I mean, almost anyone, any psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, even in chaplaincy schools, even your clergy has now gotten sufficient education in how to begin a conversation and a process around exploring childhood trauma. Again, this idea of not being ashamed of it and the idea of trying to understand what areas in your life you want to improve, and just trying to take a holistic approach. We focus a lot on the mental health part. We immediately say, oh no, childhood trauma, you got to go to a shrink. But actually, one of the pernicious effects of trauma is that it impacts the way that you care for yourself. Maybe because of a feeling that you're not worth the effort, maybe something like that. But I've noticed that a lot of people with PTSD don't eat very well, don't think that they're worth shopping or cooking for, or they don't provide themselves with the kinds of foods that will make them feel better. They don't have good sleep habits. Of course, having a PTSD will impair your sleep. Having depression and anxiety will make sleep more difficult, but all the more reason to develop really good sleep hygiene habits, or exercise, or being connected spiritually or religiously in the community, or just kind of doing the things. And none of those things that I've mentioned have anything to do with going to a psychiatrist, even though, you know, if you can, maybe you should. But it's just about really valuing and caring for yourself. And you should look in the mirror and say, you know, am I taking good enough care? Do I value myself? A lot of times people with childhood trauma, unfortunately, are attracted to people who will sort of perpetuate that narrative of you're no good. And it's very important to take stock of your personal relationships and try to find healthy relationships or people that will support you, or communities that will really support you. So all of those things are important things that you can do, not medicalized. If you have symptoms of PTSD, if you have symptoms of anxiety or depression, you should probably go to a mental health professional and see what kind of treatment options are available to you. And you should not worry about a specialist, because again, I think people now fully have embraced this idea of really learning how to talk to and help somebody that is suffering as a result of untoward experiences that have befallen them. And God bless, really, it's not easy to live with that past. But a lot of people somehow find a way to have very meaningful experiences after they can process what has happened to them a little bit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think to take it even one step further, as a psychiatrist, I will tell you that you're 100% right. And that if you go to a psychiatrist, even a great one, and you don't do the self-care that you're talking about, and the self-value work, and the self-gratitude, and the self-forgiveness, self-compassion, self-love, and all of these critically important practices that don't really necessarily take a lot of time, but they do take diligence and dedication to recovery. If you don't do those things and don't value yourself, you could see the best psychiatrist in the world and not recover from what has affected you, because it's a lot of that self-work that is really empowering and nurturing the what many people in therapy would call the inner healing intelligence, or inner healer.
Yeah. It begins with rejecting the narrative that you somehow deserved what you got,
right,
and that you're not worthy of anything better.
Right.
Because that's the implied lesson in childhood trauma, that somehow you did it, you deserved it, you created it, and none of that is true. And so as an adult, you know, sometimes just nurturing yourself can be unbelievably healing and restorative. But again, for symptoms, it's best to work with somebody who can help you resolve the symptoms.
Absolutely. And the practice, and there's so many practices that a good therapist can teach you about how things you can do at home. Even just and I think one of the major, one of the major signs of a good therapist is being able to just have someone who can listen to you non-judgmentally. If you feel judged around the person you're talking to, then you're not gonna let it out, and you're not gonna want to be vulnerable around that person. And so finding someone who you can talk to non-judgmentally, or even, I know we poo-poo this all the time, but journaling is a similar thing, because I think, the talk therapy is unique in a lot of ways, because it allows you to put things that we're circling around in our minds over and over and over again without any reflection or ability to gain perspective on, and we take them and externalize them out of our heads, and then we hear them coming out, and then we also hear what the other person, hopefully who's non-judgmental, thinks about what we're saying, and then we hear it again, and it creates this loop, this cycle of being able to self-reflect, which is so interesting, and journaling is a part of that.
Yeah, journaling is good, but I just would want to also say that some people have trouble putting their experiences into words, and that is okay. Singing, dancing, drawing, moving your body, anything like that is also a form of self-expression that can kind of get you out of the loop of your head. So journaling, for those who are prone to putting things into words, is fantastic. I think for a lot of people with childhood trauma, some of the insults occurred before they had words. So when you ask them to put things down in words, they sometimes don't even know where to start with that. That's true of some people. So again, I think I would broaden it to self-expression.
Absolutely.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you added that, because that is something that is so important that we often forget about. And some of the best artists and musicians that I know had incredible traumatic childhoods that they went through, that their entire therapy for themselves is making their art and creating and creatively expressing. It's amazing. And interacting with their art, especially when you know that their story, it's like a unique window into this person's life that is so meaningful for them and for the person who is witnessing it. I mean, it's just the creative expression is really important to not forget. Words can be very useful, but they're not by any means the end all and be all. And you also, there was one other thing you mentioned before you go, that I wanted to go back to, which was that this is really important. This idea that, as you said, 25% of people have had experiences of childhood trauma, and there's so many more people who have had adulthood. When you add on to that, almost all of us as human beings have been traumatized in some form or in some way in our lives. And so this, in a lot of ways, is the study of what unites us as human beings, and ultimately, it's not our fault that these things happened. We did the best we could at the time, and it's not our fault. And as you said, shifting that narrative away from it is my fault, everything is my fault, or that was my fault, and everything that stems from that is no, it wasn't my fault. I was just doing the best that I could. And how could I have known any better? Which is typically the case for 99.9% of people, is really critical. And that's something that we all have control over with any of these kinds of experiences in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, for some people, their traumas were a little bit more ambiguous and ambivalent, and a lot of people come in and they are absolutely convinced something was their fault, and sometimes maybe a person did do something that resulted in something traumatic and harmful, maybe to another person. And all of that is okay. Ironically, it's the same treatment approach. You still have a right to happiness. You have to make space for it. Mistakes are sometimes made. And doesn't mean that you have to live in a complete state of punishment. And I think that a lot of times when you start from a place of it's all my fault, when you have successful trauma therapy, you realize that you're carrying too much of it, and that there are a lot of other factors, and you learn how to make room for being able to see yourself as you were and all the inputs and influences um, in your life. And so, you know, maybe you're living up to some ideal that doesn't exist, or something else. But really, the idea of developing self-compassion, of really being able to understand that there are forces that you don't control. The reason that people think that they're at fault for a trauma is because the idea of being at fault for something means that trauma is not uncontrollable. If it's my fault, that means I could prevent trauma if I wanted to. I just chose not to. I'd rather think of myself as bad than the world as bad. That God is bad, or that I can't prevent things that happen. So sometimes feeling guilty about something is a defense, because it's easier to think that you're a bad person and you deserve this than to think that the world has horrible things in store for innocent people. That's a much harder pill to swallow sometimes. So all of these beliefs can be really unpacked in therapy. And they're very legitimate beliefs, and there aren't sometimes very quick fixes or easy answers. But the idea of being able to say, or to get to a place where you can really uncover a belief system or uncover a defense, you know, this, what a lot of people come from war and say, it was my fault that my buddy died. Well, that would be particularly true if it was also your fault that you went to war, that there was a war in which your buddy died. So sometimes the idea that it's uncontrollable and you have no control is a much more difficult concept than the idea that you messed up and caused harm. And that's why people are sometimes very, they cling to that narrative, but it is something that can be explored, and it's something that can be treated. And when you realize that when you're 5 years old, when a lot of child traumas occur, when you can kind of revisit how little that is, and you're not controlling almost anything about your environment, no matter what people are telling you, then you can start to give yourself a break, and you can start to develop new narratives, and maybe see things the way they are and make space for some of them, and then continue moving forward again with a different feeling about yourself that can lead to a very healing experience.
Well, very, very nicely said. And I think that's a great note to end on. I really appreciate you taking your time to join us. I know you are extremely busy. So I really, really appreciate you being here. And thank you everyone for tuning in live and for the great questions. And I guess Rachel, I'll leave it to you for the last word. Where can people find you, or where would you like people to reach out to you?
Oh, great. So I just started doing Twitter a little while ago, and I'm loving it. So at Rachel Yehuda, you can follow me on Twitter. I actually do respond. I'm also on Instagram, which which is Rachel Yehuda PhD. You can reach me by email at rachel.yehuda@va.gov. And you can follow the stuff that we do on our website. You can also follow activities in our Mount Sinai Center at MS Psychedelics. So any one of those ways are definitely ways to keep in touch with me. And please feel free to do so.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And please, everyone, follow Rachel's work on Twitter and Instagram. She posts some really exciting updates about the newest stuff going on in the field. For those who are interested, there's no shortage of exciting things happening right now. So thank you again for joining us, Rachel. It's always a pleasure. And
thank you.
have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.